This afternoon we'd like to come up, and also joining the panel are Dr. Mary Brennan, who's a senior lecturer in food marketing at Newcastle University and has been involved in consumer risk perception of food choice, and Beate Kettlitz, who is Director for Food Safety Science and R&D in Food Drink Europe. And Anne-Laure's coming up, and Patrick as well. Great. So we've got 35, 40 minutes or so to really reflect on what we've heard today, particularly with respect to the results of the FoodRisC project. That would be the first thing, but also to think about the future. So we've had 3.5 years of research in this area. What are still the unanswered questions? Where should we be thinking of for future research areas? And what are the implications for policy based on some of the results from the FoodRisC project? So I think, first of all, if I turn to the panel and ask those that aren't directly involved with FoodRisC, not Julie or Patrick, but the other four on the panel, was there anything that from those FoodRisC results that you thought was an interesting result, something that you hadn't expected, or anything that kind of grabbed you out of the results? Beate, do you want to go first?
Okay. Maybe one or two words about the last examples that we have heard, the horse meat scandal. Obviously, that is something which hit everybody by surprise. So we were at least equally surprised as others were. Alan, you might be of a different opinion, but indeed, this is something which hits everybody. And as it was said in the morning session, it hits the reputation, it hits trust in our food products. And lost trust, regain trust in food production, that's very important, and it is very difficult to gain again. And that's what I have learned today from our discussions in the morning. One or two things to mention. I think we are not good communicators. Food industry must do better. Food industry should actually explain better how food is produced. How much do consumers know how the food production takes place? Mm-hmm. And I do not only speak about processing the different ingredients. No, I speak from the farm to the fork. And I think this is something which I have learned today. We need to do better. And what I thought was very interesting when I've heard Anne-Laure Gassin speaking about the hits that you had with your videos. You said, I'm looking at your videos as well. Just congratulations. You said you had immediately 90,000 hits. Why don't we not do something like this? So that's a lesson. I go home and I will tell my colleagues, listen, we should listen carefully to the outcome of the FoodRisC project and investigate what we can do better in future.
Very good. Mary?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's been this contribution I think that the FoodRisC project has made is immense, in both in the innovation and creativity and the way you've taken things forward. Really interesting. I think one of the things that's struck me, there are a couple of things. One is we've been talking about what is relevant to people. We've been talking about impacting their everyday practices. But I feel there seems to be something missing about exploring what their everyday lives are about and how food fits into their everyday lives. And I think that is also coming through in the types of, or the focus or the overemphasis of certain social science disciplines within it, and the need for there to be more sociological and anthropological and cultural studies and political science studies coming into our understanding of people's everyday lives. And that manifests itself, I think, in one of the things you mentioned about how do you communicate benefits to people. Well, the benefits to one person of eating 5 a day might not be anything to do with health. It might be to do with their sex life. It might be to do with their skin. It might be to do with it makes them sleep better. So we need to be more creative about what are the benefits of the health, the science messages we want to deliver about food. And I think that it may possibly make benefits more sexy going forward. So that's one of the things. But you only find that out when you get into people's kitchens and you spend time in their lives. And people have different lives and different priorities and different resources that are available to them. So yes, it's the being more open, I think, to other disciplinary, and that is difficult. I've been working on a recent project where it hasn't always been straightforward because we're using the same words, we're thinking we mean the same things, and we don't necessarily. So I think it's a bit more pluralistic from a social science perspective would help. And the focus on everyday context and not making assumptions about people's everyday lives and what's important to them. And finally, the other thing that came to me from the social media, and I'm a laggard, I'm not very good at it, but it's thinking about the things. So there was no concept or no discussion about the things that we look at social media on. So what is the impact or the effect of looking at it on an iPad, looking at it on a smartphone, looking at it on a smart television, looking at it in my office, looking at it on the train when there's people around me. So thinking about the devices, thinking about the environments in which you're engaging with the material, the impact that that has on intention, the impact that that has on what people take from it, how they talk about it, who they talk about it with, the time they spend doing it. And why they're engaging in those media. Some of us might engage in it to pass time on a train, not because we're necessarily that interested in the material. So I think we need to look at the things, the time, the places and the environments in which people are being socially media, are involved in social media as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Anne-Laure?
Okay, thank you, Jo. Well, I guess I would like to start by saying just how impressive it is to hear the findings and the wealth of information that is coming from the FoodRisC project. So I want to start by thanking all of the researchers who are involved, and of course Patrick for coordinating this impressive project. I also want to underline the resource center which has been established by the group and how I think what a strong contribution that's going to make for communications practitioners. But now thinking about the presentations from today and particular insights that I took out for our work, I guess I was reassured to hear this morning Christine Prue highlight that content was still king. That's nice to hear. But we also, in the same breath, heard and understand that silence certainly is not golden. And okay, we knew that, but in this fastly evolving digital world, it's even more the case. And for a scientific organization like EFSA, that's quite a difficult task because, as Alan Reilly was saying, when before you communicate, you really need to be sure about the science if you're speaking about science, so that's really is a challenge given the speed of communications. Heard also loudly the call for greater engagement, and that's something that we are looking at actively. There were some moments in the day when you listen and you feel uncomfortable with Adrian's presentation on social media monitoring. Very impressive, but it just makes you wonder about, oh gosh, what it all is out there and how we can better get our hands and minds around that. The risk-benefit presentation was quite interesting, and I hadn't appreciated that consumers might think that risk-benefit per se could be perceived as contradictory. I mean, one might think sometimes when mandates come to EFSA, let's say from risk managers might wish to have a risk management approach. If you take, for instance, contaminants in fish versus the nutritional benefits of consuming fish, you might think that that's a better advice to give if it's well-rounded, but that it could be perceived as contradictory is something to really think about. Well, there's a lot more, Jo, but these are just some thoughts.
Fine, and finally, Anne.
Thanks, Jo. I think the whole landscape of how we communicate, has changed during the lifetime of the FoodRisC project, for sure. And I think some of the results we've seen today underpins what has changed with fairly what I call robust scientific analysis. So that's to me is really positive. What we have lost is the safe space for reflection once a crisis starts, again trying to abstract some of the outcomes from the FoodRisC project into practical deliverables for how we as regulators communicate, how industry communicates. One of the things about industry during this whole certainly the horse meat incident, was it was very obvious that industry are not on the pitch communicating on an everyday timescale. If the only time that you're out communicating with consumers and with if you like to call it your audience, is during a crisis, you've really lost half the battle. So I think maybe some of the new communication tools, which again have come, we have a bit of science now to tell us how they're used and so on, but some of those new tools, certainly for industry to communicate on a more frequent basis rather than waiting for a crisis to happen. There are other things. I think anybody who's been studying, on this project, and there's a lot of universities involved, certainly any of the graduates doing PhDs and so on, I think you've got a very bright future for employment. I think that's because this is a whole new area, and certainly, the industry, the food industry needs more expertise in this area for communication. And really, even industries that have taken up the challenge of their own Twitter accounts and so on, some of them didn't perform so well during the horse meat incident. So I think there's lots of lessons to be learned there. I think I might leave it at that, Joe. Thank you. Okay.
Trust came across in numerous presentations, and we've talked about trust again with the horse meat scandal, fraud. Again, trust, a great big battering, a bashing of the food industry. And Beate, you've talked about trust and how we might be better at communicating what food industry, what food processing is all about, and be a lot better at that. But we had a question earlier on which we left to this afternoon, which was why people, what do we do when people actually don't trust science in general? If they don't trust science, and if that's not the thing that's convincing them, what can we do? Because we're all about science-based information. EUFIC's about providing science-based information. EFSA's about science. So what do we do when science is not the thing that's motivating them?
Maybe an immediate reaction. I have the advantage that I have also talked to consumers in my previous professional life. If scientists use a language, if a scientist uses a language which is not understood by those who should understand what the message is about, the science is lost. So what I guess my message is, bring the scientific message across to those who should learn something in a way that it is understood. I think you are doing a very good job here. I mean, we can read it, and it is important. If people do not understand, it does not reach the people. So just an immediate reaction on this.
Anne-Laure, have you got any views on what you do when they don't believe in science?
Maybe just two comments I'd like to make. One is that I think it's important to reiterate the fact that decision-making and protecting consumers from risks associated with the food chain, science is important, but it's not the only factor, and so in decision-making. So I think that's an important point to bring to the table. The other aspect would be that, what can we all do collectively to better explain science, to better explain the scientific process? And that's a big challenge. But I think that's something that we certainly will be looking at more, and we can't undertake that only ourselves. But there can be misunderstandings simply because people do not understand the process of making science.
I think that this is a really important topic. But when you're trying to communicate science, like, number one, you have to be a fairly credible and transparent, either organization or unit. You have to be somebody who has a track record and is trusted by consumers. What usually happens, and I will speak now from trying to manage crisis, is that the industry concerned will get a hired gun who's a scientist, and that scientist will be out in the media with a different interpretation of the science. You can get NGOs who have single agendas, and they will be hammering that single agenda time and time again. And the form of communication, they'll be quoting many papers, they'll be quoting, call it pseudoscience. They will be retweeting tweets and as fact. So really, it comes back to who's actually communicating, their credibility. And I may say, during peacetime, you have to build up that. It's like, money in the bank. So you have to get consumers, on your side. That they have to believe that you're a credible source, of information. And regulators like the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, that's what we try and do. But and being out with your agenda, your mission statement is looking after consumers' health and looking after consumers' interests and demonstrating, day in, day out. That's what the agenda is. People will actually believe, when it comes to communicating that science.
Sometimes science can't answer the questions, and so we have to accept that and acknowledge that. And for example, with GM food, for example, some people are anti-GM because they're pro-organic, or they're anti-corporate giants owning the food chain or dominating the food chain, or they have religious or ethical objections to modifying what God created. So it's like saying to a Muslim, the ham is scientifically proven to be safe. She says, I don't want the ham. The ham is safe. Don't want the ham. So sometimes we have to acknowledge that science can't answer the questions, and trying to give scientific answers to questions that aren't scientific, we're not going to succeed. And so we talk a lot about openness and transparency with risk assessment. I think the risk managers, they take other things in addition to science into consideration, but they need to be open and transparent when they actually say, well, we've taken consumer acceptability or we've taken some other issues into consideration. That would actually help for a more informed debate. But science can't answer all the questions, and it only discredits science when you're trying to answer non-scientific questions with science.
Any other comments from the...
Yeah, just two quick things. I think sometimes I wouldn't just think about this as that people reject science. I think two things I'd say is that one has to think about the way in which people can be included in the process of understanding, discussing the purposes to which science and technology can be put. So that means involving people very much earlier in that, rather than expecting acceptance right downstream, to involve people upstream. And I think the second thing is actually, let's distinguish between the scientific process and then some sort of pronouncement about what the science has found. I mean, I think people could, it would be helpful to understand more about the process. I think we've alluded to that a couple of times today. And also that communicating this idea that it is a process of discovery, and it's not, and perhaps before things have been done wrong, by presenting it as if that was the end of the story, when actually there can be development and change and new things are discovered and so on. So I think all of those things start to put a structure around. It isn't just a simple matter of people reject or don't understand science, and that's our challenge. I don't think that is exactly what the challenge is.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers some way to answering your question from this morning. One thing that Ed said, we'll get for the Science Media Centre, we'll get the media to do science better when scientists do media better. So what can we do to help scientists get more comfortable with being the go-to expert that journalists need?
I was talking about this in the break with some media experts, and what occurred to me was the rules of engagement, this idea you can speak off the record, or you can say to them, right, I'm going to give you a certain amount that's anonymous, I don't want my name mentioned, and then I'll give you some other quotes as well. Or the sort of rules of engagement that reporters will work with or journalists will work with, I think would actually really help, certainly from my perspective as an academic, not necessarily in industry, just knowing what you can do and how you can do it and where you can do it, and with what you were saying, fostering those relationships and working with the specialist journalists who have a vested interest in the science being strong and a vested interest in there being balance across the message. So I think understanding better those rules of engagement, I think we need to learn. We need to probably educate ourselves and go on courses to learn more about what being in the media is like, and what and how we can help them and how they can help us.
So more sort of media training for scientists at different levels in their career that helps them to get more accountable. And as you say, what are the rules of engagement that everybody accepts?
It's understanding their job. I did media training a long time ago with the ESRC in the UK, and one of the Times specialist journals turned around and he goes, I've got to write 1,500 words a day, 5 days a week. And I nearly died. I was like, oh, right, I now understand. We don't write 1,500 words 5 days a week. So it's you get a sense of their day-to-day existence and their day-to-day pressures, but they need to get a sense of our day-to-day pressures and and how that works from an industry perspective and all of the cost benefits associated.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I found in Rebecca's presentation, she said some journalists oversimplify or misrepresent an issue because maybe they don't understand it and they've oversimplified it. So should that be left uncorrected? And if it should be corrected, who should be doing the correcting or the rebalancing? Or should we be left with messages in the media that are so oversimplified that they actually misrepresent the issue?
I think sometimes if you're trying to correct something that's out in the media, you may give it more legs and more attention than it really deserves. So it's really a question of balance and just on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, just fully agree with what Alan has just said. In addition, I would say that it's always important to go back and engage, though, with that journalist and try to understand, at least try to have a discussion and see where the understanding or potential misunderstanding came from, and as several people have said, to engage more in peacetime and dialogue and try to gain a better mutual understanding of the issues.
So I'd quite like to open this to questions from the audience now, but particularly thinking about the future for FoodRisC communications. Peter, you've got a question. Anybody else? David, Helen? So we've got 4 questions there. First one was Peter, hands up there.
Hello, thank you. I have a question about, we talk a lot about trust and building trust and communication and presenting information and science communication, but what about more informal communication on social media? Because a lot of communication on social media is informal, and this is also, I think, in many cases very important for building trust. So how do you see the role as organizations such as FSAI, EFSA, even scientists? Would you see their role in more informal communication? So that's my question.
Okay, that's one question. Let's take another one.
Klaus Riedmann, Ministry of Health, Germany. Since I'm not from the food chain, but rather dealing with the effects if something goes wrong, I'm more on the communication side, and I'm just wondering if social media is the only thing we can learn from all that, because my impression right now is we're just focusing on social media. But related to social media, for me it's just another medium of communicating with the public, and therefore when using a medium I have to know much more about it. And my impression is the dynamics in the development of social media is so tremendous that what is okay today in a year's time may be completely wrong. So the question is, because some even daily events may affect the use of social media. For instance, if I'm in Mexico, there was the incident that the drug society, how you call them? All those involved in drug trafficking, etc., menaced people via Facebook, and all of a sudden the usage of Facebook dropped down for a certain time because they could trace people by that way. So you have events that may affect the use of social media very quickly, and when you want to use it, for instance, in a campaign, you have to know more on, and that's what you said before, I think you want to know more about the impact of social media, and I think some more research is needed on that. Who uses it? How do they use it? in order to be able to really include it in your communication strategy. And therefore, I want to know how the panel sees that.
Yeah. David, do you want to just do your question, and then Helen?
Yes, David Zerk. Allow me to be a bit counterintuitive, perhaps, but I was quite struck by Professor Reilly's figures of 500 times more questions from the press than from the public. In France, you had a similar situation where the press were also quite strong on the horse meat debate, and what they found quite interesting in the months afterwards is the amount of sales of horse meat in the abattoirs went up quite dramatically. You could look at similar situations with the H1N1 situation across Europe, where all these great stockpiles of vaccines were not being used, even though the regulators and the journalists were very strongly communicating it. Do we run a risk of micromanaging and over-communicating on issues that maybe the public isn't so afraid of? Perhaps the media gets it wrong sometimes, but more than that, when we keep talking post-SARS, post-BSE, post-dioxin scandal in Belgium, that the people are stupid and they need to be in some way talked at. Isn't there a danger, if we look at what happened in France with horse meat sales, if we look at H1N1, that maybe we have to do things a little bit differently to maybe engage and listen to them, and that not treat, well, people are stupid, persons are not stupid.
Helen Munday from Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at Coca-Cola. I think there's been two facets that you've talked about today. One is crisis mode, but there's also the non-crisis mode, and we haven't heard maybe quite so much about the second aspect. And in some ways, I think that's maybe more difficult to deal with, because in crisis mode you have no option but to react. And in the non-crisis mode, it feels like, especially with very active bloggers, many of whom will clearly have very heartfelt views on things, maybe not scientifically held views, but they're very passionate about things. And there's nothing like a group or individuals with passion to find tremendous energy to be always on, if you like. They're looking for things, and they'll take every opportunity to engage in the debate. So I'm wondering whether the skills and the resources of those who could add the science to balance the debate have the ability to always be on as well.
Okay, let's just take those 4 questions. We've got a couple of questions there on social media about informal communications, and would authorities consider informal communications to build trust? And then isn't social media just another medium, that it's okay today, but it might change in the future? And also, what is the impact of social media? Have we researched that enough? People are not stupid, don't talk at them. And crisis mode versus peacetime communications. There are some active bloggers who are always switched on. Shouldn't others also be switched on? Do you want to take any of those? So we start off with the social media aspects, first of all. The 2 questions on social media. Julie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think to deal with Peter's query about the informal communication, as well as this whole question of, you know, the changing profile of social media, and whether the extent to which it's worth investing or setting strategies now, when obviously it's hugely fluid and changing landscape. I mean, when we wrote the bid for this FoodRisC project, and actually the writing of the bid is going back, I guess, probably some pretty much 5 to 6 years, probably. There was a completely different landscape of social media at the time of writing the bid than there is actually even now. But what we see is that people, and indeed organisations, they move in a fairly agile fashion, at least some of them. I mean, for example, we've seen on the project, you know, we've interviewed some of these organisations, and we can see that people like Food Standards Agency in the UK, for example, have quite a sophisticated social media strategy. Now, they didn't to some extent, I guess they learnt that, as they went along. But in some sense, that organisations that are following can learn from that. So I think we have to, and of course it will change, and it does change already. The Twitter environment is changing in the UK. We've had a lot of publicity around trolling and the way in which that's got to be constrained, and that's one particular element of where the structure of social media will actually start to change. And I think this links in with the question of the informal communication, because I've no doubt that in the guidance that is developed, there will be things about how you respond informally. So, for example, at the moment, DEFRA are tweeting a lot about the badger culling activity within the UK, and are responding to individual queries. So they're replying in a reasonably informal way and pointing them to things and so on. So that presumably can be part, it doesn't have to be, but it can be part of social media strategy. I'll leave it at that, because that's my thoughts on the social media bit.
Just one point that came to me, and I think that maybe it comes from that the reactiveness. That's a reactive sort of approach to using informal communications on social media. I think there does need to be some caution in the fact that people use social media as part of their private sphere, part of their private social world, and that we shouldn't assume that we can be part of that because we want to be part of it. So it's almost being quite careful not to invade people's private social spheres, which are now these, in some cases, and as was highlighted earlier on for the under 30s, is where a lot of their social interaction takes place. So you need to be careful as to whether you're a welcome communicator within that. And I think that's where the thinking about whether you proactively enter that space or whether you react to people asking and requesting your involvement in that space. And I think there's quite a distinction there.
Just on the informal communication, we've looked at the informal communication. We've looked at what other food agencies are doing with respect to having a blog. It's too time consuming, literally. To have a blog, if for instance, if somebody, a senior manager in the Food Safety Authority of Ireland had a blog, we would need about 5 people behind that person, continuously keeping stories up to date. And it really is demanding and time consuming. We do respond informally through Twitter. People will come and ask us specific questions and so on, but we're not out there proactively, communicating with a blog. Let me say the social media just being another media source. I don't believe social media is just another media source. I think it's probably the channel that communication is going. Try and imagine what's going to happen in 20 years' time with social media, and I think that's and then multiply it by 100, because that's probably where it's going to be. Even now, if you go out and do a search on the internet for something like horse meat and burger, you'll get around 16 million hits in 0.2 of a second or 0.01 of a second. I mean, say the power, of this particular medium is enormous. It's got the power to do enormous damage. It's got the power to do, enormous good. But once it goes out into the blog sphere, it's there forever, and people can fish it up, whether it's right or wrong. So I think it is a very important channel. Thank you.
Just to add, indeed, it's a very important channel and environment and changing every day, and within our network with the national food safety agencies, it's an item that we have regularly on our agendas in order to be able to learn and benefit from each other's experience in our very special area of food and food-related risks, and that is something which is quite beneficial, because at the end of the day, you do learn by doing. That's where we are, and the scene is changing so rapidly that kind of sharing with other professionals is very, very important.
Thinking about the future areas then of research in this field. I mean, one thing I picked up, I think it was you, Alan. You said, "How do we gather data to give us advance warning about what is going on and what is coming down the track?" Do we have everything at the moment? Will we have enough tools? What is it? Do we think that's missing, or where could research fit to find out how we would better gather data?
I think what we're doing at the present moment with respect to sort of emerging risk analysis is we have to rethink what we're doing with respect to emerging risk analysis. What's happening is we're collecting a whole lot of data and we're swamped with data, and it's nigh impossible to analyze, and when we can analyze it, there's really nothing there, there's no real benefit. So I think we have to go back to the drawing board on emerging risk analysis and look again and see, is there some other way of trying to use ICT to give us the heads up. Like looking back at emerging risk analysis, we went back through data that we would have collected and others would have collected to see could we get a marker for horse meat, to see was there something out there, with the current systems we're using for emerging risk analysis, and to say, look, we missed that. That was an indication that horse meat was going to pop up its ugly head, and it wasn't there. It is an area I think that we need research on, and I think building databases in cloud computing, that is an area where we need to move, and there's so much research work that needs to be done there to assist in sort of control prevention of foodborne illness. And also the whole communication sphere. What we've learned, I think, from horse meat is we need to be communicating on food fraud because it's an issue, and it's an issue that's not going to go away. And if you look at what's going on elsewhere in the world and where food is being procured and produced, there's always opportunities for food fraud, and it's something that should come more into the mainstream because it's something that's fallen off the agenda. 100 years ago, it was the main issue. I think it's really back on the agenda.
Well, it's interesting that when you talk about early warning, it's sometimes be useful to know, to monitor the dialogue in blogosphere, because it can give you an early warning of things that are happening. For example, in the swine flu, the CDC linked up with Google to monitor searches for respiratory symptoms. And so Google were able to tell them where people were searching for respiratory symptoms before there was any laboratory confirmed cases. So they're able to highlight where cases were going to occur. And often, because we live in a global village, if you were monitoring for instance of contamination and fraud, like the melamine crisis occurred 18 months before it occurred in infant formula in pet food in the US, pet food from China. So like, if you were on the ball, you could head off problems maybe by using the blogosphere.
One thing that Anya said was that when people get these mixed messages that something's good for you and then they hear that it's bad for you, then it's good for you, it's bad for you, that they then develop this indifference to food and nutrition messaging. And did you think we need more research on that? And if so, what sort of research would it be?
Oh, I think this links really with the whole broader area of communicating uncertainty, because this sort of conflict induces uncertainty. So I would say that is something that we still don't understand very well. I think it links back with the question of one of the things we can do when we're communicating uncertainty is talk about process, is to talk about the things we don't know. I think someone said this morning, things we don't know as well as what we do. And I think this area of explicit and inferred uncertainty is something that would be useful to look at more. We don't really understand it properly yet.
I just wanted to come back also to Julie's presentation and the whole Visato approach, which I find very fascinating and with a lot of implications for even the questions that could potentially come to a risk assessor. Is this whole idea of what are the questions behind the questions? Do we really know the questions that public might have in their mind? And I think that would be certainly is a very important area for further development, with implications potentially for risk managers, risk assessors, and how we approach our views about risk associated with the food chain.
Okay. Beate?
Actually, I would like to come back to the question that came from Helen. How do we communicate in peace times? What do we communicate? Can we actually communicate to the outside world, we as food industry, for example, about emerging risks? Would we do it? That's the question. And if we do it, how do you do it? Would the non-informed reader immediately understand what the uncertainty stands for? Would they not rather conclude, oh, that's dangerous? So again, we come back to the trust source, to the trust, and how do you communicate? How do you bring your message across? And I repeat what I had said at the very beginning. We need to communicate in peace times. In crisis times, we are forced to communicate. And we are forced to communicate at very short notice. What did we do? I give you an example how we work a little bit. I think it dates back to 2005 when we had the ITX crisis. You may still remember. We find the substance in our packaging or in our food, from packaging in our food, and we do not know what to do about it. So we had to be capable to communicate to, first, the risk managers. We actually informed risk managers first, because we had to say, here we have a problem. What can we do? It is the aim of everybody not to put the safety of any food product at risk. I think that's the most important message. But we need to tell people how we do it. And that's what I think we could do better, and that's also an area of further research. And
I think one of the other areas as well that we were hearing about was tailoring messages and the impact of framing the message for different audiences. So do we need more work on how you frame the message and what's appropriate for different audiences?
You've got to understand the audience in order to frame for them. So coming back to the social media, if you want to understand the impact of it, you've got to understand who they are, where they are, what they're doing. The framing is not just about the words. It's about making it relevant and making it appropriate and making it speak to them. We talked earlier, or lots of people talked earlier about stories. It's about getting them to engage and believe that it's relevant to them. So you have to understand the context of people's lives and different types of people's lives who may not be in line with what you think. And there's been a lot of work done on uncertainty, and the general public are better at handling uncertainty than anyone gives them credit for. And they handle it in different ways, as Julia's work has shown really nicely. They have different behaviours, they have different reactions. But unfortunately, what they do is they bring in political and economic and moral and ethical and social and personal factors to weigh up what's being told to them. And therefore science needs to, and Pat said that, and needs to be able to incorporate those non-physical or biological science evidence into the way in which the uncertainty and the way in which the stories are put forward and the messages are framed.
Final question there from the audience. Oh, we've got another one here. This is going to have to be the last two because we've got to wrap up now.
Thank you. I had a question concerning feedback a little bit. How far did the project analyze whether question raised by social media initiated new research? So you might have a risk communication, then questions and resulting from in social media, other medias, and how far did that initiate new research? Did you look into that? Because you should see it as interactive.
Okay, and then the other question was?
Yes. Speaking about avenues for future research, I'm a social psychologist, and the credo of social psychology for the last 40 years has been that behavior is really not a function of rational insight. We have, in particular, a lot of behaviors based on gut feelings. And our last discussions, especially about the pink slime and the horse meat scandal, made me think maybe there's something going on with the social media and the quickness of response that makes these gut feelings being more amplified now that the rounds go so quickly and there's lots of social amplification of these gut feelings. And so maybe that would be one avenue to see. People perceive certain things as disgusting due to just the word pink slime, for example, or because the cultural practice prohibits the consumption of horse meat. And maybe this is without being able to explain the feeling. This is provokes a need to communicate about this. And I think for us, this means, yeah, we have to have a strategy ready in terms of in times of crisis to respond, but in times of non-crisis also to explain, for example, things about the production and processing of food that prevents this disgust reactions, because you can educate the public and they get to accept a lot of things that happen with the processing of food. But if somebody discovers the big surprise of how meat is treated, then this can become viral if you haven't used the time to prepare the public beforehand carefully.
Okay. Julie, do you want to answer the bit about the questions raised in social media? How did it initiate any new research? So I'm thinking of the horse meat and the Visata study, actually.
Yes, I mean, if you mean did the content of social media, did anything we see in the content of social media instigate new research? I'll come back to that, but I think more generally, the thing that we saw from the importance of engaging with people, and that was something that certainly stimulated the production of Visata. But more specifically, something we haven't really talked about today is that up until last week, in fact, I was working in a computer science department, and one of the things that we've done there, leading directly out of the FoodRisC work, was actually to start to develop tools for collecting and analysing social media content in terms of, and you can't just do qualitative analysis on that, you have to use more sophisticated data visualization techniques to actually match the scale of that sort of data. So that's something, if you're interested, you can email me and I'll send you. We've now got a YouTube video up showing how that works, and it's software that people can use. But so that's something that through the realization of the scale of social media, really, that we realized actually we need different ways of starting to look at that.
Any other comments on those two questions? Any other answers? Okay. Well, it just remains for me to thank the panel for a wonderful discussion and their insights in the usual way. Thank you.